in Bordeaux, but it's just my absolute pleasure to welcome Véronique Sanders of Chateau Haut-Bailly to Vinous Live. This is going to be such an incredibly great seminar. So it's a real privilege to have you, Véronique. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Antonio. I enjoy everything you're doing. It's great to be part of it.
Great. Well, thank you. And obviously, time right now in the world. And so first and foremost, I hope that the Haut-Bailly team and you and your family are safe in this crazy time.
We're all safe. We've been actually working in the field since the beginning of the lockdown because we had to take care of the 2020 crop. And so all of our vineyard team was working hard to be sure that we're going to make a good wine next year.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of things are in a new world for everybody. So what has the work been like so far this year in the vineyard for 2020?
Well, it kept us quite busy. We had a few fears. First, the frost was frightening us, and we had to light some fires 3 times. And then a big hailstorm came not far away from us, but fortunately we were not touched as well. And then everything went fine until a bit of rain in the months, at the end of the month of April, beginning of May. And it was, I would say, too much rain. We were worried and fearing the mildew attack. But the beautiful weather arrived a few days ago, and it's drying out everything. It's now sunny and warm, and we are very, very pleased.
Yeah, well, that's obviously great news. What is the weather looking like right now in terms of your forecast for when you're going to harvest this year?
So far, it's an early vintage. That means we are probably 15 days ahead of time. We are already in the middle of the flowering. And so if it continues like that, we might have an earlier harvest. But it might change. You never know. Every year it's writing a new page, and we just we are trying to adapt ourselves to the climatic condition week after week.
Yeah, this is one of those times when you can't even make plans for tomorrow. So I don't know how you think about like 3 months from now when we don't even know, basically what's happening day to day. So it's pretty heroic, I think, making wine these days.
Yes, but I have to say that during this crisis, we've been extremely lucky to be connected with nature. It helps a lot, and it was incredibly silent. No cars around, nothing. But then the birds were singing even louder. So everything is more expressive, and it was pure pleasure watching that.
Yeah, and I bet also reassuring to see that Mother Nature has a rhythm no matter what's going on in the world. Those vines are there for hundreds of years, and they'll hopefully be around for hundreds of years, pandemic or not. So we have a lot of things to talk about. As always, we want to make these seminars as interactive as possible. So I'd like to ask our viewers to please give us your questions. The sooner you can give them to us, the faster we can weave them into this conversation. We've got a bunch of great wine. But I'm just really curious to learn a little bit about your family. I mean, you manage Haut-Bailly. You started in the late 90s. Today, we're used to seeing, maybe not enough, but there are women in positions of power in Bordeaux. But you were one of the first. So to me, you're a real pioneer. But tell us a little bit about your family's history and the stewardship of Haut-Bailly and then the transition over to the Wilmers family, because I think it's a fascinating story.
Well, Haut-Bailly always belonged to incredible people. So we are relatively new because my great-grandfather bought Haut-Bailly in 1955. So after the economic crisis of the 30s, after the Second World War, everything was down. My great-grandfather was both French and Belgian, and he already owned a property in Sauternes in Barsac. And they invested in Haut-Bailly, and he made fantastic things from the beginning. In 56, he immediately hired Émile Peynaud to start working with him. And then they've been replanting lots of the vines which were frozen in 56. in 59, and then they made investments with new sellers, etc., etc. My grandfather Jean, that lots of people knew, started to run in 79, and then in 1998 we had to sell the estate for in-division reasons and tax inheritance reasons. So we sold it to an amazing man who's American, Bob Wilmers, who was running and owning a bank in Buffalo, upstate New York, but also living in New York. And Bob gave a new dimension to Haut-Bailly and gave us a bubble of oxygen. So I joined 100% of my time for Bob in 1998.
Mm. So Bob Wilmers, who's no longer with us, unfortunately, he was the chairman and the CEO of M&T Bank, which is a regional bank in the United States that was very high. He was very highly regarded for his conservative management, especially in the era that I was working in finance, 2007, 2008, 2009. I mean, the first signs of stress, I think you saw in the summer of 2007. I remember some quant funds just having a blip, and that was kind of the precursor of subprime. But he was known for having been a very even steward and not taking a lot of risks. And the first time I met him was probably like around 2008 or 2009 at the French consulate in Washington, D.C. There was this dinner to celebrate the reopening of the Jefferson wine cellar in Monticello. And he was there, Aubert de Villaine was there, Pierre Rovani was there. He presented a wine from DRC. And I'm sure that a lot of other people were there. And I'm not sure if you were there, I don't remember, but it was like 12 years ago, which for me seems a long time ago. But it was a wonderful, it was just a wonderful evening. And the irony, of course, was at the time I had only worked for the Wine Advocate for a couple of years, but our checks used to come from M&T Bank. So every month I'd get a check from M&T Bank, and now I'm having dinner with the chairman and the CEO of the bank. It was really quite a trip. And obviously he was a very kind and warm person, very quiet, very soft-spoken. And then I remember meeting him later at Haut-Bailly, and he asked me all business questions for like a half an hour. Then he asked me questions about another business for about like 10 or 15 minutes, like really in depth. And I was just curious why he was asking me all those questions about this other company. And then he said, "Oh, I'm an investor." So hopefully I didn't make a fool of myself, but those are my memories. And then of course, what was quite touching was that he personally signed his Christmas cards. And the year that he passed away after he signed those cards. So we got this very sad news. And then, a week or 10 days later came the card in the mail. And it was I'll never forget that. I mean, that's just quite, pretty amazing stuff. So he was quite a person, and obviously the chateau is still in the family's hands, right? It's managed by his son now, correct?
Exactly. That's now the second generation who took over. Elizabeth, Bob's wife, is still there. Of course, she's currently in New York.
Of course, too.
Yeah, and Chris is the chairman of our board, running the new generation and trying to continue all the projects that Bob wanted to set for Haut-Bailly. So it's a great team. And Chris is on the West Coast, living in Santa Cruz. He's professor of environment science. So it's also a great addition because he has this vision, which is very important.
It's good to see that transition that's even. And obviously your family has been involved for, I guess, 75 years now, 65 years. So that's quite a long heritage. So I'm curious, what do you think are the most unique attributes about Haut-Bailly as a chateau, as an estate?
I think the first attribute definitely is the terroir, which is exceptional. It's very rare to find a property from which terroir didn't change size in almost 4 centuries. It's the owner, whose name was Firmin Le Bailly, in 1630, who bought all the pieces of vines around and make it one piece, one single block around the chateau. And since 1630, we have the same superficie. So it's quite special. And this terroir is fantastic. It's on a hillock. It's 48 meters high, which gives us a natural inclination and a natural drainage. So that is also great. So the microclimate of Haut-Bailly is special. The topography is special. And of course, the soil and the subsoil are very special. So the soil is mostly made of gravel, the gravels which gave the name to the region of the Grave. And the subsoil, there is a particularity at Haut-Bailly, it's with a lot of clay. And that's quite unique in our appellation. And it probably explains this consistent, this amazing freshness you find in all the wine. So Haut-Bailly's style of wine is always very elegant, you see, and that's all due to the terroir that we try to respect as much as we can.
Yeah, so we're going to talk about that in a second. So here's the map of your parcellaire, of the parcels on your vineyard. And so the main walk us through this map a little bit. What are we seeing here? For example, in the bottom corner where it's orange.
So in everything which is orange, and you see it on the upper part of Haut-Bailly, that's really the most exceptional terroir made with lots of clay. And on those soils, and I see a question coming, or not a question, but a comment coming to make me remember I should talk about the old vines, because you have 4 hectares of very old vines planted on this incredible terroir, which is a mix of 6 different grape varieties. You probably know that in the past, the blend was done in the field. Today in Bordeaux, we grow and vinify separately the Merlot, the Cabernet Sauvignon, the Cabernet Franc, etc. But one of our previous owners, a century ago, had a special recipe. He used to blend 1/12 of Merlot, 1/12 of Cabernet Franc, same for Petit Verdot, Carmenère, Malbec, and 7/12 of Cabernet Sauvignon. And you have it in front of the chateau on the highest plot of the property. And this is really the DNA of Haut-Bailly, this mixed plantation that since 2000, I'm sorting out during the harvest in order to harvest at exactly the right moment, the right maturity, each single grape variety.
And so this would always go into the Grand Vin, or not necessarily?
Always, always. It's really the heart of the Grand Vin every single year. It's always exceptional. And what is funny is that although those vines are 100, 120 years old, they handle any kind of disease. If you are, for example, in the vintage very difficult like 2013, those vines have no problem, you know. Those grapes have no problem. It's always producing the best of the best. So it doesn't produce a huge quantity. It doesn't have very high yields, but it doesn't matter because it's always exceptional, whatever the vintage is. So among 10 years, for example, you have a very respectable yield average, just because they always perform.
Okay. So that's this center here, right?
No, it's, you see the buildings go on the other side of the road?
Yeah.
Yes, and that's what, yes, you see the buildings on the left-hand side, yes.
That's over here. Okay. Okay, so this is the core here. This is where the old vines are now, I remember. And then what's this patch up here, this yellow patch?
So this is much lower. Imagine that what we just talked about, the old vines, we are at 48 meters high. There you are 20 meters lower. So it's more gravel actually, and we have some Merlot planted there, which perform also very well in very hot and sunny year. But it's not the same quality of land as what we have on the top. So we don't always put them in the Grand Vin, but in a very hot and dry year, they will make very, very good juicy wine actually.
Hmm. And then if we cross the road and start going this way, what happens here?
That's beautiful vines which were planted in 59 by my great-grandfather actually. And I love this part of the estate. Very respectable old vines. Also a more gravelly soil. But one of the, also this is performing every single year as well.
So this is also Grand Vin over here, most of the.
Yes.
Okay. And then as we move down here into this sort of light brown area.
So in this part, we've been transforming a few things, and recently we planted some Petit Verdot over there. This is a very interesting terroir, which is a bit different from what we just saw. A bit more difficult to how do you say, to run, but in most of the case, we tend to make excellent wines, very fresh, very tensed, and we quite like it. Yeah.
And then lastly, as we move here to this sector here, that's red and purple.
I don't see where you are.
Yeah. You see down here.
Oh yes. So what is interesting here is the green. I like to talk about the green part, which are little clay lentils. Also very interesting, and that's, you know, the precision of the map today. So in the past you had a plot and you were working on the plot the same way, but then now it's so precise that we are able to cut a plot into 2 or 3 or 4, just to be even more precise with the rootstock we are choosing, with the grape variety, with also the way we are growing the vines and when we will harvest everything. So you see, this is very interesting to see that it's not a monolithic terroir with just one type of soil and subsoil, but it's a mosaic of soil and subsoil, and we play with it. So that's I think that's why I chose to show you this map, just to show you how much more detail we work with, and that's a big change compared to even 20 years ago when I arrived. The first map we did was not that precise, you see. So very interesting.
Yeah, well, for sure, there's different tools now and different awareness and different level of capital available to do, you know, research like this. Obviously, that didn't exist because, as we were talking about before, it wasn't that long ago that the economic realities for most Bordeaux Chateau were very different than they are today. Everybody thinks everything is glitzy and elegant and full of money, but for most chateaux, it's only within the last generation or so that they've known what it means to be economically prosperous.
I think it's very important when you have a great terroir, to make a great wine is also very costly. And I remember Bob Wilmer's, one of his first questions to my grandfather was, "So Jean, tell me, how do you make a great wine?" And my grandfather answered this so funny sentence. He said, "Well, it's not difficult. I just spend as much money as I can." Meaning from the pruning, the way you prune, till the way you will do the green harvest, till the sorting during the harvest. You just focus on quality, and quality is expensive if you want to have the best quality. So, you know, but to have answered that to a banker, it was a
Yeah, sure, because some people want to have everything super, I think, precise, and especially people who manage money are very attentive to even the smallest expense. One of the things. So talking about wine, you know, one of the things that I've always appreciated about Haut-Bailly is just the consistency of the wines. And one of the things about Bordeaux that I think is really, you know, honestly, I think it's tough for consumers is that the hype around vintages, it varies so much. And, you know, people, whether it's the trade or even consumers ourselves, I mean, you get so, there's like feverish interest over some years, and then there's almost like no interest or very little interest over other years. It creates this very different prices for wines. And I thought it'd be fun. I mean, we have a bunch of your wines here, but I thought it'd be fun to talk about two vintages that don't get discussed a lot. One of them is 2012. I remember when we tasted this wine together at Haut-Bailly. It was one of the last, for whatever reason, I stopped by your place either at the very beginning or the very end. So the visits, I always remember those days. But this one, I remember when we tasted it, when it was just released in bottle. It was really impressive. So my own view is always you buy the winery or the chateau or the producer first and the vintage second. Bordeaux is the one place in the world still where the vintage really drives a lot of interest. But let's talk about some of the vintages that are less heralded on paper. What is it about 12 why did this wine turn out how it did?
Well, that's actually, we just talked about the terroir, and I think it's the big characteristic of Haut-Bailly is that Haut-Bailly is one of the wine that you can really trust any kind of vintage, just because of the consistency of the terroir. And we just did a few months, before the world changed, we did a vertical tasting as a tribute to Bob Wilmers with the last 20 years in a row. And that was quite a challenge to present, to taste, for example, 2000, let's say 2002 or 2007 or 2013 next to 2009, 10, 15, 16. And the people in the room were so impressed to see that there was no down, and they were really impressed by the fact that we can perform any kind of vintage. Of course, in a vintage like 13, we will do only 2,000 cases because we want to keep a certain quality level, and we work hard on the selection. But if a bottle carries the name of Haut-Bailly, it will perform. So for 2012, for example, it's a vintage which I really love for its fruitiness, its density. It was not easy to do, but we lacked some water as well. So we had small berries. And I always love the concentration of the 12. I think it's really a wine that can be enjoyed from the beginning till now and for many other years. You have a freshness in the wine. You have it's really a wine I appreciate a lot.
And it seems like it's starting to open in the aromatics a little bit, starting to get a little bit more of that kind of bottle bouquet and the sort of really pretty aromatics that make it, I think, a nice vintage to drink now, because it's not primary like it was a few years ago. It's got that beautiful floral spice kind of component.
Yes. It's very fruity. It has this freshness, which is always there at Haut-Bailly, which is also the hallmark of the Great Bordeaux. But it has the main characteristic of Haut-Bailly is always the silkiness of the tannins. Nothing aggressive. It's very smooth. It's very dense. It has a lovely density. But you will have this incredible, how do you say, sapidity? I don't know. Suavity, which makes the wine drinkable very. A bottle of Haut-Bailly can easily be drunk by two people, and my husband would say, especially if the other one is not drinking. so you just want.
It's got to be a magnum for two people when one's not drinking. No, I'm just kidding, for sure. No, that's a great quote. So, and then what about, this is another vintage that I really love. I always love this vintage, and I think a lot of people underrated it, which is 2014.
2014, great. So 2014 came just after the 13 vintage, which was so difficult for us, what a crazy vintage, probably the most difficult one in my 20 years. But 14 we like, it's very vibrant. It's a wine which has a nice consistency, a great style. Each plot was harvested at its peak, it's at the right ripeness. We had to wait a bit longer than the classic 110 days between the flowering and the harvest time. It was, if my memory is right, it was more 114 days. So it's a kind of late harvest, late vintage. We started picking on 24th of September, finishing on the October 15. What we do also at Haut-Bailly is that we like to harvest just when it's ripe. That's one of our little secrets. And we had, for example, 12 days of picking, but we stretched them among 22 days. So the recipe for Haut-Bailly is always to harvest the Merlot quite early to keep the freshness, the vivacity of the fruit. We don't like overripe Merlot, but then we will stop usually working and we will wait for the Cabernet to be perfectly ripe. Basically, a Cabernet is never ripe enough. So we will take lots of risk to wait even a with the risk of change of climate on the Atlantic, you know, we can get some rain easily in October, but we prefer to take a maximum risk, but harvest the Cabernet perfectly ripe in order to have these silky tannins, which is really the hallmark of Haut-Bailly.
No, yeah, and I think the 14 is a really beautiful example of that silkiness. It's got a lot of energy. I remember, I think I was the last person to taste Bordeaux Primeur on 2014 because of when Easter fell, and I came at when everybody was gone. It was fantastic. I mean, I'm sure the chateau owners were all tired of pesky journalists asking questions, but I kind of, especially for later vintages, I think you're just in a better position to taste. If it's a later vintage, you want to give yourself as much time to taste those wines because they're naturally going to have a slower development. And I just remember really loving this vintage. And this wine is it's a little linear, I guess. You know, I think that's the style of the vintage. They're wines that are built more on this sort of horizontal energy as opposed to like vertical, like power. But this wine is still very fresh and vibrant. And I really like the energy of this year. And I think that these are both vintages that are a little bit, you know, they're a little overlooked sometimes for many chateaux. And I think it's kind of a shame, but I think that those are the wines that people can still find without the aftermarket speculation, which is, you know, one of the things that makes some vintages hard to access later. This might be 16. So I am going to, so let's talk about 16. We'll start answering some questions. There's a question about, this might be a really great time to take Adam's question, which is about the 15 and 16. So what do you think now that the wines have been, in the bottle for a few years and you can taste them with a little bit of bottle age, what's your thought on 15 versus 16 for your wines?
Well, it's a kind of pair, because those great vintage always come by pair, which give you always pleasure, you know, from the beginning and during many, many years. So 15 at Haut-Bailly was incredibly seductive, very creamy. It was really one of the top wine of the vintage. The whole world loved it. We loved it from the beginning. So it was more of a 2009 style, incredibly seductive. And 16 had more structure. It's built more like a 10, for example. And 16, I was, before we start talking, I was just reading the weather of the 16 to remember it. And it's actually quite similar to the weather of 2019. It was a year of extreme. It was a year of records, of luck. And those records were even beaten by the one of 19. So it's quite interesting. But everything went pretty well in the 16 vintage. At the end, the winter was super rainy, which is good because then you usually have a very dry, sunny summer or autumn, and the flowering take place quickly and evenly. We had cool nights, which during the summer, which is very good. We balance with hot days, so you excellent for the aromatic. And the vines look beautiful. I remember during the harvest, I was looking at our vines and I was impressed by the beauty of the vines. And it's exactly the same impression I had in 2015. When you have this aesthetical pleasure, you know, it announces something and you find it again, you find it in the wine. So kind of great vintage. We were lucky to have it. And that is built to last a century. You know, the people who know Bailly well, they know they can enjoy it relatively early, I would say, probably after 7 years. Some vintages you can drink before, but it's always good to wait for 7 years at least. I think in England, you probably wait 20, 25, 30 years to drink a good bottle of Haut-Bailly. But then certain vintages of Haut-Bailly are mythic, like 1900, 1918, 1934, 61, 64, all kind of vintages. I was lucky to taste, and I was impressed by the longevity of a wine. to last a century is something fabulous, you know. So
we only opened at 95 years too early. I mean, what's what's the problem? Yeah. Well, no, this wine is obviously very structured. If anything, I'd say it's really closed in the bottle, which is, I think, always a very good sign for a wine that's built to age for decades. But it is really quite ferociously tannic right now. But I mean, this wine has a very different construction from the 14, because while the 14 is very linear and light, almost like a ballerina, very graceful, this wine has real gravitas, real power, real intensity. You know, it has this, it's like a baritone voice. It's like, you know, really, you really feel the weight of that wine. So, but yeah, definitely early to drink. I mean, too early to open. But so in general, you think your wines start to drink well around 7-ish years? That's a little young, no?
Well, that's a little young, of course, but I think when a wine is beautiful, you should never wait if you have the desire to drink it there, you know. And if you think of, for example, 2009 was so sexy from the beginning that lots of wine were drunk in America quickly. And why not? If you have pleasure with it, oh, it's okay. I mean, no need to wait for ages to wait for the right time. What is the right time? The right time is when you have the right people around you, the right food, and just share it, you know. So it is true that certain vintages have such structure. For example, 2010, I'm just starting to actually drink the 10, but it's still too soon. So you have such structure as a baby murder too early. But lots of intermediary vintage you can enjoy than others. And but when a wine is great, there's always a good moment to open a bottle.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's really true. That it's really the moment that that creates the opportunity, like you said. So many times people will say, "Well, what's the greatest wine you've ever had?" or all these things like this. And a lot of times it's really, what's the greatest moment you've ever had? What's the greatest, as you said, collection of your friends, or the food that you were enjoying, or the place where you are, that makes the moment. And then the wine, of course, has to, you know, hopefully it's good or great, but it's a part of a context, and what you remember is really the whole experience. I mean, but for sure, to answer the question from Sebastian about when to drink your wines, I mean, these 3 vintages, I think, they provide a nice answer to the question, because the 12 is starting to open, and it's a bit of a lighter vintage, more fruity. So that is a very nice wine to drink now. The 14, obviously it's 2 years younger, but it does have this more linear kind of style. It's definitely a wine that you can still age for a while. And the 16 is a wine you don't want to touch. You don't know if you want to wait 95 years or 20, even like they do in the UK. But I think, you know, you definitely want to, you know, that's probably a wine you start to drink when it's 10 or 12 years old, I would say, at least. But this is always why I tell our readers, in my opinion, you know, the joy of buying wine is to focus on the chateaus that you like, and to try to buy them in every vintage, because you're always going to get a wine that you like. It's just some are readier to drink in different moments, you know. So I know for myself, I like to buy just a few estates, but as much as I can of those particular estates, because I know I'll like the wines even when they're lesser vintages, you know. And the reason I started to think that way is because it's pretty common that you will taste a wine from a great chateau in a weaker vintage that is good, but it's very unlikely that you taste a wine from a mediocre chateau that is great because the vintage was great. You know, the vintage only raises the boat so far. It's much more likely that you're going to taste a lesser vintage from a great chateau that's going to make you happy. That's a much more common occurrence than the opposite, which is, I bought an average producer, but in this year they made a great wine. That doesn't happen quite as much. So that's why I think that the vintage is less. I think buying the estate of the producer is much more important than buying the vintage, personally. So
I agree with you. I agree.
So Nick asks, while you've been in charge at Haut-Bailly, what's your favorite vintage and why?
Oh my God, all of them. So, my favorite vintage. Oh God. Every year we start the year thinking we're going to make the best wine ever. And you know that we finish the year by producing what God let us do. When 2009, I'm quite proud of the 2008, which is a vintage I really love. 70% Cabernet Sauvignon, late harvest, extremely pure, precise, kind of vintage I would dream to do every year. But when 2009 arrived, I was thinking, wow, that's the vintage of a lifetime. So it comes too soon in my career and I will then suffer a lot. And then arrived 10, and then arrived 15, 16, 18, 19. And I was like, good, climate change is helping us. But so probably the vintages you are the proudest are not the most famous ones. And there is another vintage which is very dear to my taste. It's 2001. Everybody will focus on 2000, but 2001 has an elegance which is unique. You know, it's and by elegance I mean the opposite of ostentatious. You see, it's something which is refined, which is not just showing off so it's a special wine. If you can find the 2001, the 2004, the 2008, try it and let me know what are your thoughts, because I love them.
Yeah, and 2001 is another one of those vintages that not a lot of people paid attention to, and a lot of times when you taste several or do a retrospective of an estate's wines, a lot of times the vintages that come through that are really surprising are 2008 or 2001, because there's a lot of expectation baked into an 09. There's a lot of expectation built into the 10 or the 15 or the 16 or maybe even the 18 as well. But I think that a lot of times those wines that you don't expect a lot from, they really overachieve. And then there's also a lot of pleasure in that, because those wines maybe don't need 50 years to be great. And they give you a very full expression of what they can be 10, 15, 20 years out.
Yeah.
So I think it's interesting. Let's see. Another question was, what am I using to open the bottle? So this is a Coravin that Coravin did in this gold color for us. It's supposed to be called champagne, but then the Champenois, they all got upset. So they sent a cease and desist letter. I think they call it light gold. Yeah, you have one too. That looks like a Model 6.
Yeah.
That looks like a new one. Yeah.
That's not the Model 1, but I have Model 6, yes.
Yeah. This is Model 2 Coravin, which uses the needle to access wine, and I think it's obviously a great device. And I don't know if you know this, Véronique, but we Delectable, which we own, is a big part of the back end of the Coravin app that they have. So our tech team helped create what they call Coravin moments. So we do a lot of things with Coravin, and we have a really great deal on these. Actually, if you go to my social media, you can see that we have a really good discount on Coravin for our readers in the UK or the US. So that's what I'm using. Let's talk about, to finish the discussion of vintages. We could talk all day, so I don't want to take up all of your time, but I have to ask you about 2019. So what's which we also recently tasted, what is your thought on 19?
Well, I should say, as it's the last one, it's the one I'm the proudest of course, because it's the last baby. But 19 was a very extreme year. So we've been checking on the 19 at every single step. Super short winter. January was extremely cold. February, super warm, 28 degrees certain days. So crazy. And then kind of risk of frost in March, April, May. We were lighting fires frequently, and the flowering was slowed down. So we kind of, it was an early debudding, and then we moved to classic timing for the flowering. Then started a few heat waves from the end of June until the end of July, big heat waves. And you can see on this picture, actually, which was done, I think, around the 23rd of July, that the grass was completely burned. But the leafage in the vineyard was superb. It was green. And the all vines you have in front of your eyes with a long rooting system didn't suffer from these heat waves, and of course the lack of water. A few days later, the 26th of July, we had a storm which gave us 40 millimeters of rain. It was the only rain we got in July. And that was helping us a lot for the rest of the summer. Of course, we were lucky to have had these 40 millimeters of rain. But I was really impressed to see how the vine is resistant to the heat. And then the summer was great. August was not too hot. It was just fine. Hot days, cool night, just perfect. And great condition also during the harvest time. A bit of rain just before the harvest, and that helped a lot the sap in the plant to finish the ripening process for the berries. So I have to say that's a vintage. And I see a friend asking the question, we always give one word to qualify the vintage. And the word of 2019 is energy, because we put a lot of energy in this vintage all year long. And I think this vintage will give you back all this energy. You feel the energy in the wine. It's quite fascinating to see how the amount of energy you have in the wine itself. It's a beautiful wine. It will definitely belong to the greatest vintage of Bordeaux. It's very soft, supple. It has a beautiful depth and precision, purity. It has style. It's a vintage I already love.
It must have gotten those qualities from you, for your personality. But so for folks watching this picture, just to be clear, that grass that's brown, it should be green. And it is completely scorched by the heat and the drought, which was extreme. I mean, I was in France at the end of June last year and early July, and I remember, I mean, it was just really incredibly hot also in the evenings. And so that grass typically would be green. It's completely burned, and your vineyard looks absolutely perfect. I just think it's just absolutely remarkable. And so obviously we're in a time in which there's a fair amount of concern about climate change. We've got questions from Sid and William about the varietal blend in the vineyard. And do you think that is going to change over time because of the evolution of the climate, or what are you doing to sort of to deal with the situation that we're in right now?
Oh, we've been working on that part since many years, actually. And the map you saw earlier was one of the first steps to start thinking of adapting ourselves to the climatic change. We had to understand better what were our soil and subsoil, check our rootstock, and of course the grape variety. So that means if let's say in the 90s, you had more Merlot planted in Bordeaux, I guess we were going to move to more Cabernet Sauvignon, Petit Verdot, those kinds of grape variety. So we always had a majority of Cabernet Sauvignon at Haut-Bailly, and we are going to continue increasing that plant. Of course, the way we work in the field is very different from what we were doing 20 years ago. 20 years ago or 22 years ago when I arrived, we increased the leafage of 15 sun powder to get more sugar and more alcohol. Today, we are bringing it down in order to avoid having too much alcohol, because if we want to keep this balance, which is a characteristic of the wines of Bordeaux, we have to be very careful with the amount of alcohol we have in our wine. So there's lots of tiny things put next to each other that we work on in order to adapt ourselves. I have to say that since 20 years, climate change has been an advantage for our wines. And we had an amazing series of vintages since 20 years, which was incredible. But what is funny is that every year, I have to say this was the warmest year we had, compared to the last 30 years. I said that in 16, I said that in 18. I'm saying it again this year. And I'm like, this is weird, because every year I'm saying, well, this was warmer than the year before. So we keep our fingers crossed for, of course, what will happen in 50 years, 100 years. But it's when you look in the history of the vines, of the vineyards, it has always been changing. It's not something new. And I'm surprised to see that 200 years ago, 100 years ago, they were already talking like that that they have to adapt to climate change. So it's not something new, you know, and Bordeaux has been changing its grapes variety a lot in the last century. So it's part of our process to adapt ourselves to what nature gives us.
Yeah,
it's not an exceptional.
No, it's part of life. It's amazing though that 20 years ago, the challenge was getting ripe enough. Today, the challenge is not being too ripe, but climate change has brought with it a greater occurrence of good to above average to good to great vintages in the last, say decade, probably than ever before. And so I think that's quite remarkable. Do you worry ever that there could be an oversupply of wine because there's so many really great vintages sort of in a short time frame?
No, first of all, because we produce much less than in the past and you have a limited quantity. I think it's better to drink good wine than bad wine. So nobody will complain on that. And the world is growing. And everywhere, every country planting vines, they are also creating new consumers. So I'm not very worried because if those people were drinking beer or other kind of alcohol, they will move to wine at a certain time. And of course, everybody wants to discover wines of Bordeaux, wines from all over the world, because it's hard to find places today where bad wine is produced. So it's very, very interesting. I'm optimistic on the wine consumption.
Good. Well, so am I. I think it's great. So just to wrap up the discussion, going back, just to wrap up the discussion of the vineyard, you're going to keep all the 6 varieties, right? And you're increasing the Petit Verdot and the Cabernet Sauvignon. But what about Malbec, Cabernet Franc, et cetera, et cetera? Will those stay?
Oh, yes, those grape varieties are in the old vines, in the plot in front of the chateau, 4 hectares. And every time one vine disappears or dies, we will replace it by the same grape variety. So we keep planting the mixed variety, and we keep the complementarity and mixity of those old vines. And what we did recently is that we've been planting Petit Verdot, young Petit Verdot, on a plot of Cabernet Franc, which wasn't performing super well every year. And we decided to change it for some Petit Verdot, and we are very pleased with that addition. So yes, we're going to plant more Cabernet Sauvignon, more Petit Verdot. I'm not sure about more Cabernet Franc because Cabernet Franc doesn't suit the soil of our appellation. It's very tough for us to succeed Cabernet Franc. But the rest of it, but we still have, of course, lots of Cabernet Franc in our old vines, and those ones are doing well.
Yeah, I remember one of the first times I went out, I saw every vineyard, every vine was labeled.
Yes.
With a different color of ribbon.
Yeah.
So if some folks might have seen in the picture of the vineyard from 2019, it's a big crane in the background. So you have a new winery, right? So when is that going to be operational?
Well, that's a beautiful project, which was supposed to be finished this summer for the harvest of 2020. We are in discussion now, currently, with the different companies who stopped working during a bit more than 2 months to see if we can handle the delay. I'm not sure about that yet. So, but it doesn't matter. We still have our own our old cellar that we can use. So it's better to finish the project in a beautiful way than to hurry up too much. But it's an incredible project with architectural, technical, environmental prowess. And I can't wait to show it to you, because you won't really see the building. It will be a garden. My husband always says that at Haut-Bailly, I'm gardening with the vines. So the idea came that we don't want to have another building. We just want to have a garden. And inside, we have an amazing building with lots of space and comfort for working properly. So it's a great project. And it belongs to this project that I call Haut-Bailly Demain, Haut-Bailly Tomorrow, which started with 2 or 3 years of work in the vineyard to design the vineyard of tomorrow to see how we can adapt it to the climate change. And then, of course, what will be seen in this project is the new cellar. And then the last part of the project is the rehabilitation of our previous cellars for more tourism spaces.
What are the main innovations in the winery from the functional standpoint? Is it smaller tanks, gravity flow? What does the new winery give you that the old one didn't have?
We will have always more small tanks. We already had a lot, but it would be even more. We keep the duality of concrete and stainless steel. It will be gravity. It will be extremely respectful of the environment. For example, we will have our own tanks to get the rainwater and use it again. We will have a natural light from the top till the bottom cellar. So in terms of temperature, of energy and everything will be incredibly environmental friendly. And the whole process to work has been thought in order that it's the best for the wine. And of course, we also, in a parallel way, worked for a nice way to show it to visitors without interfering too much in the workspace. No, I can't wait to show it.
Okay, well, you have a question here specifically on this topic. Let me find it here. But it is about, from Eric, about when do you think you'll be able to welcome visitors again?
We actually, in France, we were able to reopen in a way since last Monday, the 11th of May. The restaurants and hotels will reopen early June. So we will probably officially be reopened for visitors and rooms at Le Pape from early June.
Okay, so that's not too far away.
That's not too far away, and we will take all the measures to respect the health of everyone, our team, our clients, or visitors. We equipped ourselves with beautiful kind of visière, so people can see us, but we will protect the people in front of us. So no, we are ready to first welcome lots of French people probably who will stay in France for their holidays, and all of you as soon as you can. Great.
I've got time for a few more questions. First of all, Bartholomew Broadbent says hello to you here. And let's talk about second wines. This is kind of a two-part question. Part is for me and part is for you. And I'll answer my part first so that you can have all the rest of the time to answer your part. But Eric asks, has your approach to HB2, formerly La Part d'Haut-Bailly, changed in recent vintages? That's your question. My question is, how should consumers think about Bordeaux second wines? So I'm going to answer my part briefly so you can answer your part with all the time you need. But basically, I think there's two kinds of second wines. And there's probably more than that, but if we wanted to simplify, we'd say there's two kinds of second wines. There's a concept of a second wine that is like a smaller version of the Grand Vin. And then there are estates that make a second wine, which is interpreted as being a second wine of the property, which is not related to the Grand Vin necessarily. So a good example of that would be, for example, on the other bank, Pensée de la Fleur from Chateau La Fleur, where the quote unquote second wine comes from a specific part of the vineyard. It is not a younger vines or a deselection or anything having to do with the Grand Vin. It is a wine from a separate part of the vineyard. So that would be an example of a second wine that is not really related to the Grand Vin. So you have a number of wines that are in that camp. And when I write about these wines, I try to explain that, which is to say it is not a junior version of the Grand Vin, some of those wines. And then you have other wines, which I would put your wine into, Véronique, which is it's truly a second wine of the Grand Vin. You get a lot of the signatures of the place and the style of the vintage and all of that, but in a wine that you can drink with a little bit less time of cellaring. And obviously it's priced more accessibly as well. So I think that's how you, I think, frame the discussion of second wines, the wines that are apart from the Grand Vin. They just happen to be second labels of the estate versus wines that are really a deuxième vin of the Grand Vin. So tell us about HB2.
Yes, and that's why we changed the name for HP2, for Haut-Bailly 2, because we are quite proud of this second wine. For us, it's a reflection of the Grand Vin. The concept is simple. The whole vineyard is worked as if we would do only Haut-Bailly every year. We are thinking, okay, we'll make as much Haut-Bailly as we can because the terroir can handle it. And the vinification is identical. And it's only when we do the blend that we will select some lots, some part of it for the second wine. And you have to know we have also a third wine behind. So we also make an amazing selection for the second wine. So that's why we call it a true second wine, a second wine which we really carries the name of Haut-Bailly and has to respect the name of Haut-Bailly and the terroir of Haut-Bailly. So it's a wine which is made, of course, to be that you can enjoy it quicker than Haut-Bailly. It's easy to drink in the first years, and it can also last, let's say, 15, 20, 25 years. I had recently some great surprises with challenging or small vintages of Bordeaux and in our second wine, and I was surprised by the quality, I have to say. So it's really a reflection of the Grand Vin, and that's why we call it Haut-Bailly Toupe as an opening, an opener to the Grand Vin. You know, it's an introduction to the Grand Vin, which is fantastic.
Yeah. So you answered your part much more eloquently than I did, and that gives us one time to ask you one more question, which is a long question, but future of primeur, what do you see?
You mean what's your question exactly? When?
No, not 2019, but just generally. Tim asks, what are your thoughts about the future of primeur as a system?
Well, with all these changes recently, I actually wrote to lots of clients around the world to have their opinion about, of course, the coming campaign and the system. And I was surprised to see how our clients around the world were attached to the system. More than 2/3 of them told us, we want to have a primeur campaign. We love the primeur system. And please, let's do business as soon as we can, because this is unique. So it was a big surprise for me, because sometimes you always hear the critique in a more important way than the positive things. And this crisis has been very positive, because I realized that it was a good system. And we will do a campaign as soon as it's possible. It will be a great vintage sold for probably a friendly price. And I think lots of people will have interest in the 19. And we will definitely continue to sell en primeur in the coming years. I see no point of changing it if the big majority of the world want to keep it, you know.
Well, Véronique, I think that's a great way to end. I think it's fantastic that you asked your customers what they want, because it's such a fundamental concept of running any business. And I'm not sure that so many people always follow that, but I think it's a great way to just, hey, reach out to people and say, what would you like to see from us? Basically, what you did was what you did, or you said, what do you think about this system? And to get the answers from your own customers is really powerful, because at the end of the day, every business is really run by its customers. That's who pays all of our salaries. So thanks for your time. It's just great to hear your enthusiasm and your positivity. I've got a whole box of Bordeaux 2019 to go taste, but cheers to you. Best of luck with 2020. Thanks for being on our show, and I'll talk to you